Early access. Love it or hate it, it serves a purpose. Developers can release an early build of a game, intentionally, and players can enjoy it. In return, they get valuable feedback and valuable money. Giving a huge audience access to the game during development is a great way to gather community feedback, provided you're willing to sift through tens of thousands of opinions. But what if I told you there was at least one major change made to Baldur's Gate 3 based on community feedback before early access had even launched? My name's Chubblot, but because we're friends you can call me Chubblot, and today I'd like to talk about the lost narration of Baldur's Gate 3.
My skull pounded in response to the prisoner's white-hot stare. Her lips didn't move, yet I heard her voice.
This video contains data mining and companion spoilers. The first gameplay reveal of Baldur's Gate 3 came in February 2020. The reveal stream gave us everything we've now come to expect from a Larian stream, minus the armor. Unlucky rolls, threats of murder, and a coup de grace delivered by footwear.
Oh, that's it. Good work, good work.
I actually got banned from Wikipedia because I tried to add that to its list of shoe throwing incidents, which is a real thing that actually exists. For anybody who isn't aware, Larian's original plan for Baldur's Gate 3 was to have your chosen character deliver the narration lines.
Just yesterday I had been seducing a young noble, luring him to my master's lair.
And this went hand in hand with the way dialogue options were presented. They were all written in the same first-person past tense style. But if you've played Early Access, you know that dialogue options are now presented completely differently.
Oh, easy does it, lass. You really don't want to do that.
Very shortly after the gameplay reveal stream, people began sharing their opinions online, and one thing that came up a fair amount was the narration, and reviews weren't exactly glowing. Despite a handful of hiccups, this early build of the game felt impressively complete, so it made sense when Larian initially decided to double down on this feature. In March 2020, during an AMA on Reddit, CEO, director, and professional cosplayer Sven Vinker responded to a question about the narration style by writing, "There's several reasons we're doing it this way. Of course, there are story reasons, but it also allows you to get closer to your character, their thoughts, their feelings, and moments of introspection, allowing you to truly understand their motivation. We've experimented with several styles when starting development, but this was the one that at the end of the day stood out, and we're actually quite excited by what we can do with it. It turned out to be an excellent way of allowing players to tell their own story and roleplay their character on a deeper level. I think it's a wonderful tool for role-playing and storytelling, and when you're playing, it's like you're narrating your own adventure." But even that in-depth explanation couldn't placate the angry Reddit bros, and they weren't the only ones weighing in. Eric Kane, writing for Forbes, even put out an article claiming that the past tense narration style was the one thing he disliked about what he'd seen of the game, describing it as incredibly off-putting. He compared it with the way tabletop games are normally played and came to the conclusion that past tense narration makes no sense. In a similar vein, Camden Jones, writing for Screen Rant, highlighted his issues with both the past tense and first-person aspects of the narration. He said there is a lack of clarity between what's being said and what's being thought, which he concluded causes issues with immersion. So this kind of left Larian in a bit of a pickle. Despite trialing various different narration styles, they'd landed on the first-person past tense style as their favourite.
Suddenly I saw what she saw, felt what she felt. Anger. Confusion. Resolve.
However, the internet disagreed with how effective it could be. People wanted their video game to be more like their tabletop game, and this created an inevitable clash between the developer's daring dream and the preference of the prospective player pool. And one would have to give. In June of 2020, Sven again presented some live gameplay of a pre-release build of Baldur's Gate 3, and very early on it was clear that things had changed. The lines had been rewritten to now depict what your character was actually saying rather than their thoughts. And there was an entirely new disembodied narrator played by Amelia Tyler.
She is testing you somehow. About Raphael.
This means that in the just over 3 months between the AMA and this stream, Larian had completely swapped out their preferred narrative style for one that better fit with the community's preference.
The tadpole squirms in your mind. It seems sated.
But it can't be that big a deal, considering the size of the game and how little turnaround there was between the AMA and the second stream. They can't have had that much of the first-person narration recorded. right? Well, before we carry on, I just need to give you some basics about Origin characters and the voices available to custom characters. These are the spoilers I mentioned at the start, but if you've been following this channel anyway, then none of this is going to be news to you. There are currently 5 companions available in the game. In addition to those 5, we believe we are getting at least 3 more: Karlach, Helia, and Minsk. All of these characters will be part of the Origin system, meaning that like in Divinity Original Sin 2, you'll be able to select one of them as your protagonist. Or you can create a custom character with their own voice. You can choose from 4 different voice profiles right now, but there are an additional 4 profiles that are still locked as of patch 7. So a total of 16 possible voices for a protagonist, meaning 16 possible narrators. And as it turns out, Larian had started to work on most of them. I don't want to talk too much about the Origin companions in this video, but here's a comparison of how many first-person narration lines I found for each of them. Don't put too much stock in the specific numbers because there are repeated lines. For example, Gale looks like he has the most, but if you adjust for repetition, Gale, Lae'zel, and Shadowheart all have pretty similar amounts. Astarion has slightly less, Will has noticeably less, and the voice I believe to be Helia has about 100 fewer than Will. Karlach and Minsk tie for bottom place. Karlach doesn't seem to have any first-person narration files, and Minsk has no voice files in the game at all. Which isn't to say he doesn't have any lines, they're just not said by him.
Bah! A festering boil on Faerun's fair buttocks. Boo and I know it well.
But since he's an iconic video game character with a long history and a beloved voice actor, I think we all know he's going to be voiced by the legendary Chris Pratt. It's a weirdly similar situation when talking about the custom voices too. I'll give you a little example of each as we go through to jog your memory on what they all sound like. Voice 4,
let's hope the locals are friendly,
barely comes out on top, followed closely by voice 1,
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
and voice 7.
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
Then we have voice 5,
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
voice 8,
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
and voice 2.
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
Voice 3
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
and voice 6
Let's hope the locals are friendly.
have no first-person narration that I found, and that might be an indication that their voice work and possibly Karlach's didn't get done until after Larian had changed the narration style.
I just saw a chance and I took it.
As you can see, quite a lot of work had been completed before Larian changed their minds, or rather had their minds changed. Over 7,000 individual voice files were suddenly rendered obsolete. In terms of narration, they were effectively back to square one. But they committed to meeting the player base's expectations, and Amelia Tyler has done, and I'm sure will continue to do, an excellent job. It's just kind of sad we'll never get to experience the narrative the way the devs had initially intended. Unless...
His ears twitched as he lowered his head, inviting me to pet him.
I'd already done the work of cataloguing the lines, and I just thought, well, maybe I can find a way to use them, to Frankenstein this feature back together and parade its corpse around on YouTube in the hopes of someday having more subscribers than that woman who lets her baby drink river water. I was left with 2 options. Option 1, my preferred option, is the one I used to put together the companion narration videos. Option 2, the messier option, is how I made the first-person narration work during my recent live stream.
And it slaps.
Option 1 is very straightforward. Load up the game, go into the settings, mute the narrator, record the scene, open Premiere, drop in the correct line, and done.
A magic mirror.
This gave me total control over everything from how loud the lines were to how long pauses lasted. It was an incredibly tedious process, but a couple hundred edits later and I had what I thought was a decent emulation of what once was.
The magic was old and wavering, but it was essentially an expensive lock hiding some secret. The face was crafted to be pleasing, but the personality was just a reflection of the wizard that created it.
Speak your name.
So you might be thinking, if option 1 is so good, then why does option 2 even exist? Well, thanks for asking. As of patch 5, Larian removed the setting that allowed you to change the volume of the narrator independently. And this was done because I don't know. It makes no sense to me. I thought it was a useful feature. Maybe there's some really technical reason it was removed, but I used to use it all the time because to this day, even with the narrator's lines being re-recorded, I find the narration noticeably quieter than the rest of the voice work.
Your mind twists. You're looking out of unfamiliar eyes, prowling dark, busy streets. You try to hold the memory, but it fades to the worm, the light, the fear.
What was that? What's going on?
It was nice being able to give it a bit of a boost without also boosting every other voice in the game, but maybe that's just me. So anything beyond patch 4 made option 1 a no-no, meaning I had to bite the bullet and actually make a mod. I put it off because I thought it'd be tough, but actually it was super easy, barely an inconvenience. I'd already identified the lines and separated them by character, so overriding the in-game narration was a relatively straightforward thing to do. But option 2 isn't without its own problems. Did you know that every voiced line is given a set duration for how long it has to play? So if you try to shove a 7-second file into a 5-second gap, the line gets cut off.
The creature cringed, overwhelmed by the throngs, and revealed its own home in reply. A humid cove filled with decaying myconid corpses.
While the majority of lines were quite easy to replace, some of the repeated ones did give me a lot of trouble. I'll go into that later. And obviously any narration lines added to the game after the launch of Early Access have no first-person equivalents, meaning there's a lot of this.
As the pain muddled my thoughts, our minds became entangled. A familiar sensation. She too carried a parasite.
Darkness seems to swallow the temple, leaving you with a vision of the goblin priestess receiving instruction from a handsome young man.
So, it's far from perfect, but I have now played through the game using the first-person narration for every character it's available to. That's 12 playthroughs. And the question I'm left with is, did it work in the way Larian hoped it would?
The foul thing was at my mercy, and I would have its head. I felt compassion. Compassion? I couldn't move, couldn't think. Thinking was mercifully done for me. It would be a joy to serve it. Dying an honor. It was possessing my mind, forcing me to love it. But then the feeling slipped. The creature's mind seemed to focus elsewhere.
Just to remind you, the first-person narration was intended to help players feel closer to their character, to understand their thoughts and feelings. It was quite literally supposed to be a way to give your custom character a voice.
The bear's heart leapt. Was that a look of recognition on the man's face? No, it was nothing. The bear let out a disappointed huff.
I also think this was one of the ways Larian was trying to address a common complaint about custom characters in DOS 2. Lots of people felt that their created character was far less fleshed out than an origin character, which made it difficult to connect with them. And while the first-person narration wouldn't have totally prevented this problem in Baldur's Gate 3, I think it could have helped.
Suddenly I was him. I was hauled into a great storm, with as its eye an orb beating with malevolence.
Out! That was uncalled for.
With the current system, you select a voice during character creation and then only sometimes get to hear your character speak. There are context-specific lines for when you interact with certain objects.
Devilkin, am I in the hells?
Generic point-and-click barks that I almost always turn off.
Never wanted the easy path.
And even the odd moment where your character pipes up during a cutscene.
True soul? Absolute? What were they raving on about?
Which happens so infrequently that people have been consistently shocked by it for the last year or so.
This could spell trouble.
In fact, cutscenes make up the bulk of interactions in the game, and it's during these cinematic moments and conversations that other characters really start to develop.
What's it gonna take to shut you up, Horns?
You can see their emotions, their gestures match their voice work, and it all works together to help establish their character. And in that situation, the sore thumb was always going to be the character whose voice is almost never part of the medley. Now, obviously with the first-person narration, you hear your character constantly during those all-important cutscenes.
I noticed the armored man twitch. He was about to erupt.
You hear their thoughts, they express their feelings, whether it's abject terror or a flush of emotion during one of the game's few intimate moments.
She trailed off. I read an invitation in her eyes.
It helps to establish them as an individual in the context of the world around them. I feel more like my character is an entity of their own rather than just the skin I'm wearing to experience the game. And while I prefer that, not everyone does. Some people want to be able to play as a fantastical version of themselves, and for that they may prefer the current style, which is completely valid because ultimately this is all subjective. But there is one thing I hope they salvage from the first-person narration.
Fungal roots wove through my mind, seeking my true intent. Then the Sovereign droned a new melody, cautious but welcoming.
Earlier on, I mentioned repeated lines and how replacing them gave me a bit of trouble. By repeated lines, I mean things like this.
The corpse regards you lifelessly.
Lines you hear over and over, but as part of different cutscenes. The reason these lines were specifically a nightmare to work with is because they're actually not repeated. They exist as different files, even if the content of those files is almost always identical. So why have multiple files for the same line? Why not just have everything point to the same file? Because originally, the Speak with Dead lines were not repeated.
The spell elicited a gasp. A weak echo of life.
There was variety.
The corpse became quiet. It had nothing further to say.
And it goes even deeper. Sometimes the game acknowledges things about the person you're communing with, whether that's a generic comment about their race.
The drow's corpse twitched as the magic took hold.
Mentioning characters by name.
Draw Ragslin's body, lurch to life.
Or even more specifically, taking into account the condition of the corpse, like the heavily decayed body you're told about in the toll house.
The corpse was decomposing, but intact. Its mouth fell open as it turned to look at me.
Or the body of the man who failed at cliff jumping.
His neck was broken from the fall, but his mouth opened as he looked at me.
I feel like this is objectively more interesting than hearing the same line over and over again, and I really hope this is a planned feature for Amelia's narration, because despite how much I like the first-person narration, I don't think it's coming back. Just imagine the time and the cost it would add to the whole process. We only have some of Act 1 right now, and the narrator already has over 2,000 voice lines. With 8 Origin companions and 8 player voices, that makes a minimum of 16 potential narrators, meaning they'd be adding over 32,000 lines to the game just to cover Act 1. To put that number in perspective, DOS 2 had over 74,000 voice lines for the entire game. But that still isn't the most likely reason this feature isn't returning. At one point, this style was Larian's plan, meaning they weren't deterred by the huge cost and time investment involved. If anything, the current style is probably much easier from a development standpoint. The reason we're probably never going to get this feature is because of the response to that first livestream. Based on like an hour of gameplay, the internet decided this was a terrible feature. And to Larian's eternal credit, despite the director's own stated preference, they did what people wanted. They changed it, and that's something to be celebrated. A company that actually listens to their audience. It's depressingly rare. However, I am not a game developer, but in my opinion, if you're adding a feature specifically to help players connect with the character they are playing as, and you know you're going to be using early access as a way to gather feedback, maybe the best feedback is going to come after people have had a chance to use said feature. I'd argue the true test of the first-person narration could never really have come as part of an hour-long stream, because the chance of anyone in that audience making a tangible connection with an Origin character being played by someone else was slim to none. But that's just like my opinion, and trust me, I know I fall on the less popular side of this discussion, But if you, like me, didn't even know this feature existed until well after it was cut, I welcome you to discuss this in the comments. I welcome the likes and even the dislikes. Don't worry, I can still see them. They'll still make me cry. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.